In November 1941, 23-year-old Rosemary Kennedy lay on an operating table at George Washington University Hospital. She was conscious. Doctors had given her only a local anesthetic, enough to numb the scalp where the blade cut through skin and bone, but nothing to dull the awareness that kept her present for every second of what came next. Dr. Walter Freeman stood beside the table and told her to sing "God Bless America," then to recite the Lord's Prayer, then to count backward. These weren't comforts. They were instruments of measurement. As long as Rosemary could sing, could pray, could count, her prefrontal connections were still intact. Dr. James Watts, the surgeon, inserted a butter knife-like instrument called a leucotome into her brain and began severing white matter, stroke by stroke, while Freeman monitored the girl's voice for signs of degradation. "God bless America, land that I love." The singing grew halting. Words from the Lord's Prayer tangled and frayed. Counting faltered, then stopped. Watts kept cutting. He cut until Rosemary became incoherent, until the young woman who had written diary entries about her day and curtsied before the King and Queen of England went silent on the table. Freeman would later describe the result with a word that belongs in his own indictment. He said he had bleached her personality. Bleached. That was his clinical terminology for what he'd done to a 23-year-old girl who walked into that hospital under her own power and would never walk properly again. Joe Kennedy Jr. wrote to his father from Harvard, praising Adolf Hitler's sterilization of the disabled and calling them disgusting specimens. Joe Kennedy Sr. received that letter. Then Joe Sr. authorized the surgical destruction of his own intellectually disabled daughter's brain and hid her from her brothers and sisters for 20 years, her mother making virtually no mention of her in letters, as if she didn't exist. Every scrap of the family's own writing builds the same case. This was ideology dressed as medicine. Rosemary's first injury happened before she ever drew breath. On September 13, 1918, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy went into labor with her third child at the family home in Brookline, Massachusetts. The doctor was late. Physicians across Boston were overwhelmed by the Spanish influenza pandemic tearing through the city that fall, and the attending nurse made a catastrophic decision. Rather than allowing the birth to proceed, she forced Rose to keep her legs together and physically held the baby inside the birth canal for roughly 2 hours, waiting for the doctor to arrive and claim his fee. 2 hours of oxygen deprivation silently destroyed cells in Rosemary's developing brain. Rose Kennedy herself would recount this agonizing detail in her own words, and one family account captured the implication with devastating directness. If the doctor had arrived on time, Rosemary would have been fine. That sentence trails off into nothing, because there's nothing left to say. A nurse's greed created the disability that would define Rosemary's entire existence. A medical professional's decision to delay a birth for a doctor's paycheck set in motion a chain of suffering that would stretch across 86 years of a woman's life. Decades later, Rosemary's own father would use that disability, the one she was born into through no fault of her own, as justification for destroying what remained of her mind. Rosemary, before the lobotomy, was no helpless figure confined to a sickbed. She attended dances and social events and documented her days in a diary, existing as a full human being inside a family that measured human beings by their usefulness. When the Kennedy family traveled to London for Joe Sr.'s ambassadorship, Rosemary was presented at court alongside her mother and sister Kathleen, wearing a picture dress of white tulle and silver paillettes, navigating one of the most rigidly formal social rituals in the Western world. She managed the elaborate curtsy before the King and Queen of England, this from a young woman her own father already considered defective. Rosemary did it, and she carried herself through the entire evening. Assessments placed her at roughly a fourth-grade intellectual level, but she had opinions, desires, and a personality that drew warmth from the people around her. Her diary entries captured small pleasures, social gatherings, outings, the texture of an ordinary day lived with genuine engagement. Rosemary Kennedy was a young woman with limitations who was living a real life. Limited, yes, but entirely and unmistakably hers. The ideological framework behind what her father would do to that life ran straight through the Kennedy household and out into the broader currents of American elite culture. Joe Kennedy Jr., the eldest son, the one being groomed for the presidency, wrote to his father from Harvard praising Hitler's sterilization policy. He described disabled people as disgusting specimens. The eldest Kennedy boy, studying at America's most elite university, looked at Nazi Germany's program of eliminating the unfit and saw something worthy of admiration. His father, the man who would soon authorize the lobotomy of his own daughter, received that letter without recorded objection. The Kennedys weren't outliers among their class. American eugenics had been mainstream elite ideology for decades by the time Joe Jr. put his admiration on paper. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled in Buck v. Bell that forced sterilization of people deemed unfit was constitutional. That ruling became legal bedrock for the sterilization of tens of thousands of Americans, overwhelmingly people with intellectual disabilities, people in poverty, people of color, people whose bodies and minds the state had decided were unworthy of reproduction. States across the country ran sterilization programs with relentless efficiency. Nazi Germany openly cited these American laws as inspiration for their own programs, the very ideology Joe Kennedy Jr. praised from Harvard. American scientists built the template. Germany scaled it industrially. And the traffic of ideas between the two nations flowed freely among the kind of elite circles where the Kennedy family had purchased their seat at the table. Within this framework, disabled children from wealthy families were routinely hidden and made invisible. Institutions absorbed them. Family narratives erased them. Eugenics wasn't fringe theories circulating in shadowy pamphlets. It dominated university curricula, medical journals, Supreme Court opinions, and dinner conversation among exactly the social class the Kennedys had fought their way into. Joe Jr.'s Harvard letter proves the family had internalized this ideology before the lobotomy decision was ever made. What Joe Sr. did to Rosemary wasn't a medical choice that happened to go wrong. It was the logical conclusion of a worldview his own family committed to paper. After the Kennedys returned from England in 1940, Joe Sr.'s ambassadorship over, his reputation damaged by his pro-appeasement stance on Nazi Germany, Rosemary's behavior reportedly worsened. Accounts describe developmental delays compounded by convulsions and violent rages that intensified after the upheaval of leaving London. She was, by some reports, sneaking out of the convent school where she'd been placed, potentially exposing herself to danger and, more critically to Joe, potentially exposing the family to scandal. Nuns were struggling to manage her increasingly erratic behavior. For a patriarch who viewed every family member as an asset or a liability to his son's political futures, Rosemary had become an uncontrollable risk. Joe Kennedy Sr. had made a fortune in banking, in Hollywood, in liquor. He'd served as ambassador to the court of St. James's, though that tenure ended in disgrace after his defeatist, pro-appeasement stance on Nazi Germany. His political ambitions for his sons, Joe Jr. for the presidency first, John as the backup, required a family image of vigor, intelligence, and flawless competitive spirit. A daughter with an intellectual disability who was sneaking out, exposing herself to danger and the family to potential scandal. In the America of 1941, that meant institutional commitment, public scandal, or both. Joe went looking for a third option. He found the most dangerous doctor in the country. Walter Freeman had arrived at neurology by way of ambition rather than surgical talent. He was a neurologist, never trained as a surgeon, qualified to diagnose disorders of the nervous system, not to cut into living brains. That gap in his credentials didn't slow him down. Freeman had been evangelizing the prefrontal lobotomy as a miracle cure for every form of mental distress and behavioral difficulty. Dr. James Watts, the actual surgeon, did the cutting at George Washington University. Over his career, Freeman personally performed more than 3,000 lobotomies, while the broader movement he championed consumed thousands more patients each year across American hospitals. He gained substantial popularity with local and national media through his self-promotion and his willingness to perform procedures with theatrical confidence and minimal caution. His methods grew more extreme over time. He pioneered a transorbital technique that involved driving an ice pick-like instrument through the patient's eye socket, a procedure he could complete in under 10 minutes, often without surgical backup, on patients who'd barely been evaluated. He traveled the country in a van he called the lobotomobile, performing assembly line lobotomies with the urgency of a salesman working on commission. Freeman's patient outcomes told a story his self-promotion worked tirelessly to bury. Patients emerged from his procedures with shattered cognitive function and permanent personality obliteration. He would eventually lose his medical privileges after a patient died on his table. But that reckoning came decades too late for the thousands already hollowed out under his blade. A tour guide at a historical site, upon speaking Freeman's name, reportedly snarled that he was a butcher that should have been hanged. In November 1941, Freeman was still riding the crest of his reputation as a medical pioneer. He assured Joe Kennedy that a lobotomy was the best option available for Rosemary, promising it would calm her, eliminate the rages, and make her docile and manageable. Joe Kennedy listened. Joe Kennedy decided. He decided alone. Rose Kennedy wasn't told beforehand. Rosemary's siblings weren't consulted. Rosemary herself, 23 years old, capable of writing diary entries, capable of attending dances, capable of being presented before royalty, had no voice in what would be done to her own brain. On that November day in 1941, weeks before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would drag America into the Second World War, she was brought to George Washington University Hospital and placed on the table where Freeman would ask her to sing. The destruction was total. Rosemary emerged from the procedure unable to walk, unable to speak coherently, unable to control her own bodily functions. Her mental capacity regressed to that of a 2-year-old child. One academic assessment captures the outcome with brutal precision. The procedure failed, not by actualizing Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s dreams of morphing Rosemary into a docile daughter, but by annihilating her entirely. The girl who had curtsied before the King of England now needed to be fed, bathed, and dressed like an infant. Her eyes, which had scanned ballrooms and royal receiving lines and the pages of her own diary, stared without recognition at the people standing over her hospital bed. Joe Kennedy surveyed the wreckage of what he'd authorized. He did what he always did when a deal went catastrophically wrong. He buried it. Rosemary was transferred to St. Coletta, a residential facility in Jefferson, Wisconsin, run by Catholic nuns. The location was strategic. Jefferson sat as far as possible from the Kennedy orbit of Hyannisport, Palm Beach, and Washington, as remote from the family's social and political world as Joe could manage without sending her abroad. Compared to the overcrowded state institutions where most Americans with intellectual disabilities were warehoused in filth, subjected to restraints, and sedated into stupors, St. Coletta represented a humane option. But humane confinement is still confinement. Rosemary would spend her days in a wheelchair, moved through routines she couldn't fully understand. surrounded by caregivers rather than family, her entire world reduced to a single institutional campus in rural Wisconsin. She would never walk properly again, and her speech remained largely unintelligible for the rest of her life. Nothing restored what the leucotome had severed in those few minutes on the operating table. Then the erasure began in earnest. Jo Kennedy hid Rosemary's whereabouts from her own brothers and sisters for 20 years. Joe Jr., John, Robert, Edward, Eunice, Patricia, Jean. They had all grown up with Rosemary in the clamorous Kennedy household, sailed with her, competed alongside her, shared holidays and summers at Hyannisport. And then she was simply gone, and their father forbade any explanation. Rose Kennedy, informed only after the lobotomy had already been performed, acquiesced to the conspiracy of silence. Rosemary's name dropped out of family correspondence. During JFK's 1958 Senate re-election campaign, the family publicly described her as merely reclusive. Other cover stories circulated over the years. She was teaching, she was living in a convent, she preferred privacy and solitude. Each lie required constant maintenance across shifting political landscapes. Each passing year demanded fresh deflections when reporters or acquaintances noticed the absent Kennedy daughter. Rose Kennedy's letters and public statements across those 2 decades contained virtually no mention of Rosemary, as though her third child had simply ceased to exist. Holidays required careful management of her absence, political campaigns, and there were many, as one Kennedy after another sought office, demanded rehearsed responses for anyone who noticed the missing sister. Holidays, weddings, funerals, each carried an empty chair that nobody was permitted to acknowledge. The Kennedys built their public image on unity, on that iconic vision of touch football on the compound lawn and sailboats on Nantucket Sound. They maintained that image through the deliberate amputation of one of their own from the family narrative. Hiding a brain-damaged daughter from her own siblings for 20 years, that's worse than any horror fiction, because fiction ends when you close the book. Rosemary's erasure renewed itself every single day for 2 decades. Joe Kennedy Sr. reportedly never visited Rosemary at St. Coletta. The man who chose the doctor, authorized the procedure without his wife's knowledge, and witnessed the catastrophic result, never once traveled to Wisconsin to sit beside the daughter whose life he had destroyed. That single fact demolishes any claim of parental anguish more effectively than 1,000 pages of argument. Meanwhile, Rosemary existed in permanent diminishment. Her speech remained largely unintelligible for the rest of her life. She required total institutional care, feeding, bathing, dressing, every aspect of daily existence managed by the nuns and staff around her. The young woman who had navigated a royal court presentation, who had written diary entries and danced at parties and formed opinions about the people she met, was gone. She remained in this state for 64 years, making her, in one scholar's assessment, probably the longest surviving recipient of a lobotomy. From the autumn of 1941 to the winter of 2005, Rosemary Kennedy lived out the sentence her father imposed, outliving the patriarch himself by more than 3 decades. Joe Sr. died in 1969. Rosemary died in 2005. She spent 36 more years on Earth than the man who had put her away. Each of those years a silent rebuke to everything he had done. The defense argument for Joe Kennedy's decision deserves its one honest hearing. Rosemary was experiencing escalating violent episodes and convulsions. Nuns at her convent school reported she was becoming unmanageable. Lobotomy in 1941 hadn't been discredited. Egas Moniz would receive the Nobel Prize for developing the procedure in 1949, granting it the highest scientific endorsement available. Options for intellectually disabled Americans in the 1940s were genuinely horrifying. Overcrowded state institutions, where patients were warehoused in filth, subjected to restraints, sedated into stupors. By this reading, Joe Kennedy was a desperate father in a desperate era, reaching for what the medical establishment promised was a cutting-edge solution. That is the strongest version of the defense. The 20-year erasure reduces it to rubble. A desperate father doesn't hide the result from his other children for 2 decades. A grieving parent doesn't describe his lobotomized daughter as merely reclusive during a Senate campaign. A man acting out of love doesn't refuse to visit for the rest of his life. Joe's unilateral decision, his concealment of the procedure from Rose, 20 years of enforced family silence, cover stories tailored for political campaigns, and his total refusal to see his daughter again. Taken together, these actions are consistent with a man who had disposed of an inconvenient problem and needed the disposal to stay hidden. Nothing about his behavior after November 1941 resembles a parent in anguish. Everything about it resembles a fixer managing a liability. The wall of silence held for 20 years, maintained by the iron authority of a patriarch whose children had been trained since birth to obey without question. In December 1961, Joe Kennedy Sr. suffered a massive stroke. Paralysis claimed his body, speech abandoned him entirely. The man who had controlled every thread of the Kennedy narrative was suddenly trapped, unable to give orders, and unable to enforce the silence he'd maintained since 1941. With the patriarch incapacitated, the truth finally reached his children. Rosemary's siblings learned where their sister was and what had been done to her. Some were already in their 30s and 40s, with political careers of their own. John was President of the United States when they discovered that their father had authorized the destruction of their sister's brain and concealed her from them for their entire adult lives. The family that made loyalty its highest sacrament had been built on a foundational betrayal of one of its own. Eunice Kennedy Shriver acted first. In 1962, she published an article in the Saturday Evening Post that acknowledged, for the first time in the family's public record, that Rosemary Kennedy was intellectually disabled. The article shattered the pretense that Rosemary was merely reclusive or teaching, but it didn't reveal the lobotomy. That secret held for another 25 years, until historian Doris Kearns Goodwin exposed it in her 1987 book about the Kennedy family. 46 years after the procedure. The secret outlived JFK's presidency and assassination in Dallas. It outlived Bobby Kennedy's assassination in Los Angeles. It nearly outlived the entire Cold War. But Eunice shattered the fiction of Rosemary as reclusive or teaching, and she went further than disclosure. In 1968, directly inspired by her sister, Eunice founded the Special Olympics, dedicated to providing athletic competition and dignity to people with intellectual disabilities worldwide. That organization grew to serve millions. One sister's destroyed life became the foundation for something Eunice willed into existence through decades of advocacy. Whatever redemption exists in this story belongs to Eunice alone. More recent scholarship has pushed the examination into still darker territory. Maureen Callahan's book, Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed, advances allegations of sexual abuse as a possible factor in the decision to lobotomize Rosemary. These claims represent what some researchers now argue, drawing on behavioral patterns and circumstantial evidence. They lack primary documentary verification, and that caveat must be stated clearly. But ignoring them entirely, as a competitor documentary on this subject did, drawing accusations of whitewashing, would be its own form of erasure. The documented, verified evidence stands damning enough on its own. Joe's unilateral decision, his concealment from Rose, 2 decades of enforced silence, and his absolute refusal to visit his own daughter all build the same indictment from independent angles, each one sufficient by itself. Every generation of Kennedys after Rosemary's lobotomy was stalked by catastrophe. Joe Jr. was killed in an explosion over the English Channel in 1944. Kathleen was killed in a plane crash in 1948. JFK was assassinated in Dallas in 1963. Bobby was shot dead in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen in 1968. Ted drove off a bridge at Chappaquiddick in 1969. JFK Jr.'s plane went down into the Atlantic in 1999. People call it the Kennedy curse, and they've been calling it that for decades. Maybe it's just probability playing out across a large, reckless family that lived loud, public, dangerous lives. Or maybe every tragedy that followed carried the weight of a debt, a cosmic pound of flesh collected on behalf of a girl who sang "God Bless America" on an operating table until the blade made her stop. Rosemary Kennedy died on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86. She'd outlived her father, her mother, 2 assassinated brothers, and a sister killed in a plane crash. She outlived the entire mythology of Camelot. 64 years in institutional care, and the woman Joe Kennedy had tried to erase from the family story refused to disappear. Rosemary never got justice in any courtroom. Freeman was eventually stripped of his medical privileges after a patient died on his table. Joe Kennedy Sr. spent his final years paralyzed and mute after the 1961 stroke, trapped inside a body that could neither speak nor command, dying in 1969 without ever publicly acknowledging what he'd done to his 3rd child. Rose lived to 104 and never publicly reckoned with her complicity in the decades of silence. The family transformed Rosemary's suffering into the Special Olympics and called it legacy. But legacy is what the powerful construct to avoid the word they actually owe. Joe Kennedy's actions against his daughter crossed every line from family tragedy into outright crime, ideological, deliberate, and sustained across 20 years of enforced silence. The evidence is his family's own letters, his doctor's own words, and 2 decades of his own absolute refusal to face what he'd done. That verdict was entered long before any of us showed up to read it. Subscribe for more stories like this.